The chart you just saw was a visualization of the dynamic and honestly borderline impressive inflation launch in Venezuela from the years 2013 to 2018. Let's back up a bit. Venezuela is a country located on the northernmost region of South America and is home to a plethora of fauna, flora, natural landscape, and bustling cities. In the past decade, however, Venezuela went from the country with the largest oil reserve to a practicing economist's nightmare. In 1998, political leader Hugo Chavez headed a new political movement titled the Movement of the Fifth Republic, which was received with overwhelming support. This movement was essentially founded on sympathy after Chavez was imprisoned based on charges of seeding corruption within the military. The new political structure rejected common democracy and founded a philosophy based on overthrowing current political leaders in place of Chavez. In 2007, Chavez abandoned these common ideals and adopted yet another political party, the Socialist Party of Venezuela. Chavez used the socialist agenda in order to increase the country's nationalization, reducing the economic influence from larger states like the US, and granting loans to Venezuelan neighbors by using oil and petroleum. It wasn't all bad though. By 2004, Chavez used this petroleum and oil revenue in order to create food subsidies, healthcare, improved education system, and reduce the country's poverty by 50%. Unfortunately, Venezuela's dependence on oil only grew at this point, and thus caused a growing deficit, meaning that all of these programs would be eradicated if oil prices ever fell. And fall did they ever. The mismanagement of resources globally led to a decline in oil profits worldwide, as the Venezuelan economy started a downward trend, and after Chavez passed away due to cancer in 2013, Venezuela had a power vacuum. To put it lightly, hit the fan. Elected on the 5th of March 2013, Nicolas Maduro was Chavez's hand-picked successor. His presidency was disputed from day one, and the country's National Assembly was accused of vote buying, imprisoning multiple opposing political adversaries, and even holding elections 4 months before the official election date. Since Maduro's election, the country's economy has become even more unstable. According to a poll conducted after Maduro took office, around 80% of resident Venezuelans wanted him out of the country. In response, Maduro pushed the country into an authoritarian rule, forcing out all prior existing politicians and replacing them with his subordinates. Maduro also created the National Constituent Assembly, which would have the power to rewrite Venezuela's constitution, leaving no opposition to his rule. This sparked protests along the country and is still taking place to this day, injuring thousands annually and causing countrywide violence. But what do all these factors have to do with the country's inflation rates? The biggest myth around Venezuela's inflation rates is that the government was poor and just simply printed money. This isn't entirely wrong, but it's not the entire story. Due to a lack of political regulation following Maduro's election, the official exchange rate for the Venezuelan bolivar, their version of the dollar, per US dollar was 10-1. Due to this static exchange rate working in tandem with the ever-changing market of imports and exports for the country, Maduro's policy exponentially ravaged Venezuela's pre-existing deficit problem dating back to Chavez's presidency. The select exchange rate and overspending of money whilst not handling the country's overall debt caused an economic fallout we call hyperinflation. Oxford Dictionary defines hyperinflation as monetary inflation occurring at a very high rate. But you might as well erase that definition and put a picture of Venezuela instead. They wanted to break records. Imagine if your definition of relax was sitting on your porch watching the sunset, and then your friend sits next to you and says, yeah, my version of relax is smoking crack. And crack is exactly what the Venezuelan economy did under Maduro's rule. Maduro had in place a very extreme restrictive pressure on every economic import and export for the country. The process was slow at first as annual inflation rose to 56.3% from 2013 to 2014, and according to the National Bank of Venezuela, increased by small percentages month by month. For example, October 2013 had an increase of 5.1%, November 2013 had an increase of 4.8%, December of 2013 had an increase of 2.2%, and January of 2014 in the next year had an increase of 3.3%. These inflation rates grew exponentially with every passing year. Prices for most Venezuelan industries started to rise at this point in time. Necessities like housing and food prices was 5% higher than they were the year before. The country's resources had a dichotomous result, and resource scarcity rose from 22.2% in December 2013 to 28% in January 2014. Government policies such as currency controls and the price caps were implemented in hopes of inhibiting these ever-rising shortages, but they were unable to keep up with the damage that was frankly already done. This colossal shift in the country's monetary system caused President Chavez's once subsidized programs for food and healthcare unaffordable for 82% of the Venezuelan population. And in 2016, things went from bad to worse. Maduro gave complete access to the country's primary food supply to the military and close political leaders. These groups would import and purchase food using the 10-1 exchange rate that was set by Maduro's presidency, and then sell it back to the general public on these black markets at an inflated rate. In August of 2017, the exchange rate for a single bolivar to the US dollar was 12,163 to 1, and has only since increased up to 2022. The Bolivar Soberano was a new Venezuelan currency that was released in 2008, but then it was fully adopted in 2021 in order to combat the inflation rate. And as of December 1st, 2022, both currencies, the Bolivar and the Bolivar Soberano, are in circulation throughout the country. According to the Central Bank of Venezuela, the country has officially exited hyperinflation as of January 2022, as the inflation rate decreased by 50% since early 2021, but the rate is still staggeringly high, the highest we've ever seen in human history. While the total inflation rate is decreasing back towards an equilibrium, the exchange rate is still anything but fixed. Currently, $1 US is equal to 11.6 of the Bolivar Soberanos, which isn't terrible, but $1 US is also equivalent to 1,038,950 Venezuelan bolivars by standard measure. Taking all of these factors into account, you have to wonder how this is affecting the population of Venezuela to this day. Hyperinflation in the country has reduced access to food, healthcare, and other basic goods, leaving the majority of Venezuelans at risk for malnutrition and food insecurities. According to the Human Rights Watch, approximately 14% of all children under 5 years old in Venezuela suffer from acute malnutrition. 57% of pregnant women are malnourished, and about 32.6% of the total population experiences acute food insecurity. The 2021 Living Conditions National Assessment estimates that around 94.5% of the total population in Venezuela are considered marginally poor, and 76.6% of Venezuelan households live in, quote, extreme poverty. This multidimensional poverty has led to the deprivation of basic healthcare. Shortages of medical supplies and the departure of medical personnel has caused a rise in all diseases. Even previously preventable diseases such as measles have reemerged. Access to clean water has also caused severe sanitation problems. In 2020, the UN claimed that only 13.6% of the population in cities had regular water supply, and 4 out of 10 households suffered daily from electrical outages. As of December 2022, 547,567 cases of COVID-19 had been confirmed in Venezuela, and limited testing means that this figure is likely an underestimate. Citizens that test positive are sent to temporary shelters for 15-day quarantine. These shelters have been lacking in food and medical supplies since the very beginning of the outbreak. All of these symptoms, pre and post-COVID, are due to hyperinflation jacking up the prices of basic healthcare. And Venezuela urgently needs medical supplies every single day. But where would they get it from?
The United Nations is asking for additional humanitarian aid for Venezuelan refugees.
As humanitarian aid for Venezuela left homestead and headed to Colombia.
A country in crisis, now stricken with the pandemic.
Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is blocking life-saving humanitarian aid from getting into his collapsing country.
UN High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi is asking for neighboring countries' help.
Food and medical supplies from the U.S., Canada, Colombia, and other countries are sitting at a Venezuelan border.
The situation in Venezuela right now is really quite tense.
Being an original member of the UN since 1945, what other nation states and international organizations have done to help remedy the Venezuelan situation? Let's preface first. Political and economic globalization are characterized by the emergence of intergovernmental organizations such as the UN, international non-governmental organizations such as NGOs and the Red Cross, and a more maximized importance of global trade. Being an integral part of the oil business worldwide, Venezuela is a key piece in global political and economic industries. After the country's hyperinflation peaked in 2018, the situation was deemed a humanitarian crisis by IGOs and NGOs based on several different factors. One of these being something that we're very familiar with, the Fragile State Index. This is a global statistic evaluated every year and ranks countries' fragility based on 4 primary indicators: cohesion, economy, politics, and sociality. Venezuela received a score of 91.6 out of 120, putting Venezuela far into the red zone, currently ranked as the 26th most fragile state in the entire world. Governments and international organizations swooped in to help the country out. Whether it was out of the kindness of their heart or for Venezuela's oil reserves, who's to say? According to the United States Agency for International Development, over $314 million was put towards Venezuela's stabilization efforts and humanitarian assistance. This was in 2022 alone. Because the US and other affiliations around the globe were publicly backing Maduro's current political rival, Juan Guaido, Maduro insisted on rejecting all aid offers including food, nutritional supplements, hygiene kits, and medical supplies up until 2022. According to a BBC press conference in 2019, Maduro has gone on record stating, quote, "Never been, nor are we, a country of beggars." Thankfully, this did not stop humanitarian efforts from trying. Because the country's hyperinflation created a scarcity of resources and violence in the streets, even more humanitarian orgs such as the Peace Corps have attempted breaching the border in 2022. Atop all the horrific information that I've given you today, this is the silver lining. Recent humanitarian efforts have been becoming more and more successful after the pandemic. The country scored a 4 out of 5 on the ACAPS Humanitarian Access Index in July 2022. This is a scale that measures the state of humanitarian access globally over the past 6 months. This spike in humanitarian aid has led to a domino effect for the imports and exports of the country. In turn, these foreign aid programs have eased restrictions on the import of medical equipment. So in 2022, things are looking up. The reason I chose to illustrate these two concepts is because they are very, very real and very, very important symptoms that have stemmed from the country's departure from hyperinflation. The idea that the country's downfall was caused from an overprinting of money is not only reductive, but it's a gross simplification. The hyperinflation was due to an extreme authoritarian government with an overreaching rule on the country's resources. Without this political corruption, Venezuela could have made it out in one piece. Historically speaking, if the country didn't gatekeep its resources to the government and military, we could have been looking at a South American superpower on par with Brazil. In conclusion, the Venezuelan predicament is a messy hodgepodge of political and economic variables that created the perfect storm of total monetary collapse. Be that as it may, I predict that the Venezuelan citizens will remain hopeful. The country is slowly but surely making its way towards a brighter future.